Hello and welcome to Fantasista, the number 10 podcast. I'm Jimmy Reeby and this is my show about football's number 10s and all things playmaker related, told through exclusive interviews, stories and discussions. Talking tens with me in this episode is former international footballer Pat Nevin, who delightfully weaved his way through a variety of topics, just like the defenders who used to leave standing throughout the 80s and 90s. We discussed his youth football experiences, developing his playing style, a shock to the system from a tactical point of view at professional level, and his thoughts on the British perception of the number 10 shirt, plus difficulties we've had producing world-class talent for the role. Or have we? Pat also gives fascinating insight into exactly what goes through a professional player's mind when creating a moment of magic on the pitch, as well as revealing his favourite playmakers and much more. So don't let me keep you any longer, enjoy the show and please let me know your thoughts on our discussions afterwards. A little disclaimer before we begin the episode. I'd like to apologise for the quality of the audio and the conversations in this episode. I was really disappointed with how the recording turned out, and I was really torn on whether I should even release the episode at all. However, in the end, I felt that Pat's insight and excellent point of view are too good not to share, so I've tweaked and salvaged the audio as best I could, and hopefully you'll still be able to enjoy Pat's knowledge and experiences. Thanks for understanding. It's fantastic to be able to welcome onto the number 10 podcast Pat Nevin, former professional footballer, now broadcaster, who played well over 100 times with Chelsea, Everton and Tranmere Rovers, as well as playing for Clyde, Kilmarnock, Motherwell and representing Scotland numerous times. So firstly, thanks for coming on the podcast, Pat. I've wanted to speak to you for a while now, really after I heard your investigation on BBC Radio 5 Live into why Britain has failed to produce number 10s, which I think you did back in the year 2011. Can you tell our listeners why you undertook that task and why the number 10 is important and of interest to you?
Well, I suppose number one is when I went through the game, I played for nearly 20 years professionally, and my concept was we should be more, not more like the South Americans or the Latin countries, but certainly being able to look out at other styles and other systems. But I felt through a large part of my career, we were quite one-dimensional as a British group. Now, we changed from one or two little systems, 4-3-3, 4-2-4, 4-4-2, but it was always straight lines. And I'd actually, before I became a professional, played for Boys Club. And the Boys Club, they were sophisticated enough to actually play with number 10s and play with different, more sophisticated systems. So, I couldn't believe it that my Boys Club was playing more sophisticated football than the professional teams I was playing with. I found it staggering that was the case. Now, we played internationally quite often. You play more sophisticated systems and more subtlety about the way players found their games. And some of the managers I worked under were able to give me a slightly different role. But in the fact that I'd started my entire career, I'd never played in the wing. When I played professionally, they went, "Oh, you're small and skillful. Go and stand out in the wing." And I'm thinking, I'm not a winger. I'm a kind of 10. I'm a guy who plays alongside a 9 or behind a 9. So it was quite a shock to play in professional football, to realise that where I'd been watching and learning about world football all those years, well, the professional game in Britain hadn't. And it was quite disappointing. So I thought we should have had more, because it's not that we can't produce them. We can produce talented players in that. We've always been able to do it. The problem is there's hardly ever been a position for them in the English and indeed the Scottish game.
That kind of neatly segues into the next few questions I was going to speak to you about. One was regarding your playing position. We look on Wikipedia and such, they're fantastic sources of information, but there's often more to the facts that are published on there than you see. And on there, your playing position simply states winger. And that's me growing up in my preteen years during the 80s. Whenever I saw you play and descriptions I read involving you, that's the impression that I got, that you were a winger. So I was going to ask you if you agreed with being pigeonholed as such into that one position.
I think it's accurate in that the vast majority of my career, they stuck me out there and I had to learn how to do it. So certain managers, certainly at Chelsea, I was given a certain amount of free rein to be able to go and cause trouble where the danger was. And certainly when I played for Scotland, particularly under Craig Bryant, He'd had me at Clyde, and he'd been very, very similar. He'd said, right, you start on the right wing, but where you finish is where you finish. It's where you see the danger. You do what you like. We trust you. Because they knew that I was technically adept enough to know where to go when we weren't on the ball. But you get pigeonholed into these wee areas. And, it's not the worst thing in the world to be pigeonholed into. But it used to slightly annoy me in the fact that every now and again, throughout my career, there would be an injury to somebody, and I would be stuck as the second centre forward, and I'd invariably score a goal or two and create stuff. And then you say, right, okay, can I have a run at that position? And the manager would go, no, the centre forward's back next week, you go back out in the wing. Now, to be fair, in the wider sense of my career, I could have moved abroad. I had two opportunities to move abroad, and I could have played in that position for Paris Saint-Germain and secondly Galatasaray. But I chose to stay, go to Everton instead and go to Tranmere instead. So I can't really complain about it too much. The possibility was there. The opportunities were there. But for complicated reasons, I couldn't go at that specific time. But it is a bit of a shame because I think we've had enough players that are capable of playing in tens of, we've gone to that, no doubt, but tens of complex positions, a number of different ways of looking at it. But certainly I've looked at British football in the last number of years. Now, we haven't created any in that position or many in that position over the last 30 years. But have we created players who are good enough to play in that position? Well, yes, we have. 100% we have.
So you think as well that's, a reason why the British Isles hasn't associated itself with the number 10 in the same way that other countries have is because coaches, and especially around the time of your playing career, as you mentioned before, they tended to always stick with straight lines and formation and be rigid in structure. It didn't allow you necessarily just full reign to attack or very rarely did. They also needed that balance in defending as well. I've heard you mention in the past that some of your old coaches actually referred to it as a cheats position when you wanted to play there.
Oh yes, that was the description. The most common description of number 10 in Britain was the cheat. As in, you don't need to work back, you don't need to cover, you don't need to do the hard work. And of course, it's completely and utterly ignorant rubbish because the 10 does work and the 10 does cover and the 10 does lots of different things and, or can do them. Not all do. If you go back into historically, we know the Argentinians have done it. We know the fantastic well. We know the Brazilians have and the Spanish have. They've all produced great number 10s. So the Italians and many others. But the Brits kind of haven't generally. But if you look back at, say, the 1970s, and you consider somebody like Rodney Marsh, or you consider somebody like Alan Hudson, and you start looking around and actually there's quite a lot there. There actually is quite a lot. Tony Curry was another one. And the part of the reason, I don't know if this is true or not, I mean, it's just a supposition on my part, is that some of those guys were kind of larger than life, lived life well, if you know what I mean, and weren't actually all the hardest working people you've ever seen. So although they were stunningly talented, more talented than most of the rest of the players around, if not all, by the way, you could almost put Georgie Best in there because he could play in that position as well. All those people to that degree, that time, there was a drinking culture, there was a culture of, layering it up a little bit. Now, whether that coloured the view that the British football establishment had of these creative players, I think that's an interesting point. I really do. I think that's a really interesting point, because if they'd all been like, say, Kevin Keegan, and hard-working, he's not a classic 10, but he played in that area. But if they'd all worked hard like him, then maybe they would have been more accepted within the game. And especially during parts of the 80s and the 90s, and even in, the start of the Premier League, when power play was the most important thing and physicality was the most important, and along with pace in the English game. You ended up just putting those guys out with that attitude out. It's a shame that, because if you'd have had somebody who was a great 10 and a hard worker, a really good spirit about them, like Dalglish. Oh, like classic, perfect possession for that, but hard working as well. But they always look back in these other ones who they felt were cheats or not completely dedicated to their profession. So that had an attitude towards it, and that gets complicated by a number of other things, which includes your attitude towards whatever the sport is. And Robbie Martinez came up with a great idea, which was the British game, the English game particularly. It's all about what your second game is. I don't know if you can remember this argument Robbie gave.
I do. Just for the benefit of those who haven't heard this theory, in a previous interview conducted by Pat, Roberto Martinez believed the country's footballing attitude is also heavily influenced by its second game. So, for Spain, it's basketball, with its control, possession and strategy. And in the UK, it's rugby, with territorial advantage and chasing the chance to score. It's a fascinating point.
Yeah, and I thought it was stunning. I thought about physicality, pace, possession. Whereas it's a totally different idea where your second game is something else that is much more subtle than rugby, and our game's rugby. So is it one thing? No, it's a multitude of things that caused inability for British teams to develop these tens. But I look at it now, and I look around the Premier League and I think, there's loads of them coming through that can play there. There really are. No, I mean, not loads, but there are. They're there. I mean, Grealish is classic. Absolute classic player.
Grealish. Oh, brilliant! Absolutely brilliant!
Now, at the moment, he's stuck generally out on the left-ish wing. He's a guy who could play that position. I mean, even go back to Rooney. Rooney was a guy who classically could have been, if he'd have been born in Argentina, Brazil, he'd have been a 10 and he'd have played there all the time and he would have been that position. But because he was born in the British game, he was changed into something slightly different. And that's just the way it is. You live by the culture you are brought up in.
Do you have a favourite number 10 you'd like the podcast to be the subject of? Or perhaps you've got more to add from this particular episode? Let me know on Twitter at Fantasista10. That's at Fantasista TEN. You can find more on Instagram at the same place. Even more on the website fantasista10.co.uk. That's Fantasista10, and on Facebook and YouTube at the same handle. British media, culture and in particular the Premier League now appears to have woken up and recognised fully the number 10 as a term, conversely at a time when classic number 10s aren't really around. However, I feel that there's still a bit of confusion, or maybe people see it as semantics, between a player being a 10 and all that encompasses and a player playing as the 10. Best example I can give is Dele Alli and before him Steven Gerrard. People would say he's the 10. Well, kind of, yeah, positionally and role-wise. However, they aren't naturally 10s, and for me, that's the same as Teddy Sheringham and Wayne Rooney.
Yeah, you will be right. But again, it's the culture of the game, the culture and the time of the game. The most classic number 10 that I probably played with was Peter Beardsley.
Oh, what a goal! By Peter Beardsley. He fooled everybody, even his colleagues, and the crowd are thrilled. That is improvisation of a very high order.
And Peter Beardsley would be perfect for a 10 if he was brought up in another culture, and did play in that position quite often, off Lineker and things like that. And you'd call it a second striker here. But you're right, that position of 10, and of course we know the number is absolutely unimportant. It's nice when you have it, but it's not important. It's where you play and the type of game you play. And sometimes, there's certain systems, there's no position for a 10. There's no place for a 10. If you play a 4-3-3, and there's a lot of teams like Man City playing 4-3-3. However, Silva, probably a 10. De Bruyne, probably a 10. You can look through teams like that, and you think, well, they've not got an actual, but they have got those types of players. So it is difficult for certain people. If you are only one position, I mean, you watch the last number of years, Riquelme and players like that, absolutely classic 10s. With Banega playing. And then Banega is almost a caricature of a 10, even to the point of his behaviour is not the best either. And people say, oh, well, there's no room for that type of player. Well, he done all right. He done all right against Manchester United. He done all right against Wolves. Now, he doesn't play sitting in the hole between the midfield and the striker. Yeah. That's the ignorance of the British thinking what a 10 is. 10 isn't that. He found where the space was. It was at left back. And then controlling from there. He just found where the space was. And it's a different side. And you can't imagine almost any player in British game doing that. If you taught Stevie Gerrard in the past to do it, he'd do it. Yeah, it's fine. But that concept is a concept that's so alien. And classically, when I asked, a few years back, when I asked Ozzy Ideas, why we don't, my first question to him was, doesn't Britain create number 10s? And his answer was to laugh at me. He just laughed. He said, you can't do it because you haven't got the psyche. And I said, well, some of us have. But he said, no, but the game hasn't got the psyche for it. So if you come to playing a game in this country, in the Premier League, and it's still the same to this day, you better go and adapt your game. And to be fair, that's no different from the day I walked into Chelsea. You know, I had to adapt my game right away, or else I wouldn't have got a game.
Right, okay. I think I remember your little anecdote about Ozzy Ardila when he was talking about Diego Maradona, whereby he said in his teams the defenders and the midfielders would have kicked him out of coming back to their playing positions or their areas of the pitch if he'd ever attempted to come back and help, because they wanted him fresh in the areas where he's supposed to do damage, and they understood that, so they didn't want him coming back and helping out defensively.
Exactly, and again, that is the classic South American attitude. But you just don't get that in Britain because you're back to that cheap thing. I mean, it's culturally, I draw a line with, Charles Hughes,
yeah,
and that concept where that was taken on board. And all the years of the Watfords and the Wimbledons and the Crystal Palaces, and to be fair, England as well, for a period of time. And the early days of the Premier League, I couldn't stand the Premier League in the early days. I thought it was garbage. You know, it was all this big singing and dancing, and everyone saying how great it was, and I'm going, no, it isn't. It's fair and cool. And the thing is, I just moved to Tranmere then, and people going, no, I've actually just been better. And I'm going, no, it's about rubbish. It's just physicality and nothing else. I haven't said not everyone was, because some of the teams would bring in, you know, like the Cantonas or whatever, or Zola for a while after that. Now, that's not to say we didn't create really good players, you know, like Stevie G or Lamps. We did. In those early days, honestly, there was some players that I just didn't think they could play football. But they could run hard, and they could chase, and they could tackle, and they could head. I was playing it for the love of the game, and I was still loving my game where I was playing it. So it didn't bother me either way. But when I look at it now, up until recently, what happened with Barca, you know, with Xavi and Iniesta and Messi, what happened after that with, to some degree, Manchester City, although recently it's not been great. They showed you that you can do it. You can be successful doing that. I don't want to be smug, but I'm thinking, well, I told you all that about 30 years ago. It's a good idea to go and try and play that way. Because if you keep the ball, they can't score. And if you shouldn't be, there is other ways to do it. And I suppose when you look at it, and if you stand back and look at it over the years, and particularly now, teams that are winning things aren't those big physical lumping teams. They're winning nothing and have won nothing for a long, long time. And the teams that are winning things are, you know, your Liverpool, so play a really nice brand of football. Man City play gorgeous, almost Barcelona brand of football. And that's kind of the way it's been for quite some time. And it's not the right way. It's just a way I happen to prefer.
Okay. So we discussed a lot of points there, and said about the classic number 10 doesn't really exist in today's game, but there are 10s about there. What would your ideal number 10 look like? What attributes do they have? And I know there's complexities again defining a 10, as you said before about Eber Banega is completely different to another playmaker, but I think historically that's always been the case. You've had the likes of Roberto Baggio and Rivaldo, who play differently to the likes of Andre Pirlo and JJ Okocha, but I would see them all as definite examples of number 10s.
I would probably put Pirlo more in the Cinque, number 5, you know, they're creating from a wee bit deeper kind of one, but I know what you mean, but you have to be adaptable within it, and you know, where you actually play in the pitch is kind of almost secondary. But what is the classic one? And it's a great question. Who is the classic? It's probably Diego. It might be Messi, but Messi spent much more time a little bit further forward. But if you had to go and paint a picture of someone who can pass it brilliant, who can dribble, who can score a goal, who's fabulously creative. Yes, but they're not the only way. Cesc Fabregas, or periods of his career, he was this beautiful playmaker. Then he sat back to be more of a number 5 as well, you know, pinging the balls from a little bit deeper. It's really hard to say the exact perfect one, because the ones that were perfect at it, the two that I've mentioned, they adapted, they changed, and they played 10 sometimes, they played somewhere else sometimes, they played what suited them sometimes. And maybe that's the best thing about a 10. You're intelligent enough to adapt when you need to adapt. But there's a whole entire bunch of them. If you watch South American football, the place is overrun by them, and always has been. You know, some of them are better than others. There's Valderrama, a wee bit, one of them a bit taller, etc. There's so many of them. And I'll tell you something else about them. There's some of them I like and some of them I didn't like.
Right.
There really is quite a lot of them I don't like. basically, I've got a problem with cheats, right? So, and remember, you go back to the kind of South American attitude towards the game. The idea of like Diego's fabulous, but I will always prefer Messi. I don't know if Messi's better, but I'll just always prefer Messi because Messi's kind of more honest. Whereas Deco would do anything. He would pick your pocket. He would do anything at all. And I want somebody to be, like almost like a Zidane. You will always try and do the right thing. You won't cheat. You will win by being utterly and completely, totally brilliant. You don't need to do the other stuff. And that's kind of the ones that I've always liked. All those names that you mentioned, through in Platini and all that as well. There's so many of them. To pick up the perfect one or the exact one, I just don't know if it exists. But if you put Messi on the ball in the right area, he can do all the things that 10 needs to do.
You mentioned Zidane there. I mean, there is a lot of them who've had a bit more of bite to them. I think Zidane got sent off numerous occasions during his career as well. So there is that side of the game to certain number 10s.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong with having an edge. That's often a good thing. The difference between having an edge and being a cheat. I mean, I've got a real problem with quite a number of players, say, in the Premier League, who dive in a bit. It's just ridiculous. Just don't know if I can relate to them, because they will always do that. You didn't get Cruyff diving about.
Can you describe how you developed into the player you were as a youngster? How often did you play? Did you have any regimes? Did you play with friends and family? Do you have any specific ball games or drills?
Yeah, it's a complicated one with me, and fortunately, I've just written a book about it, so about 6 months you can read the book. In actual fact, my dad had been a boxer, but he also was a football coach. So I trained with him every single day from the age of 4 or 5.
Right.
And that meant dribbling it in and out of cones. What he used to do was he would go and watch Celtic training. Because you used to just walk in and train in those days. And their coach was Jock Stein, probably one of the greatest coaches ever lived. At that time, Celtic were arguably the best team in Europe, could win the European Cup, and some amazing players were there. My dad just used to watch their techniques and teach me their techniques. And I used to go and watch them. He was also a coach of youth teams and things like that as well. And I was playing 3, 4, 5 games a week as well. And the odd thing, see, in the midst of all that, never wanted to be a footballer. Never ever wanted to be a footballer.
What was it you wanted to do?
I was doing a degree and I was going to just become a teacher, which I thought was a much more sensible thing to do.
Right.
And I turned down Chelsea for a year. I loved playing so much that I didn't want the joy to be coached out of me. I've never been somebody who's particularly interested in money or things like that. So, fame, certainly I can't stand, and celebrity I can't stand. So what was the reason to play football? Well, the only reason is to enjoy that. Well, I can do that with my mates on a Saturday and a Sunday. I love training. I was a distance runner as well. So I had all those things. The skill stuff, that was very specifically my dad. I'd read Pelle's book by the time I was 7 or 8, Jimmy Johnson. And then we'd go and watch these teams, these great teams. And then the next team that came after them, that took over from them, had some bloke called Douglas. It wasn't bad either, And I was sitting watching them every week. So it's all about learning. And any time I ever saw anyone do a trick or a skill, got a ball, and I would do that. I would love to say I was a natural player.
That leads perfectly on to my next question. We often hear or use the phrase that a player is so naturally gifted, particularly when it's in relation to number 10s. Where do you stand on the whole nature v nature debate? As a player, would you or did you ever feel slighted if it was suggested that you simply had a special talent and that all the hard work and sacrifice, 2 descriptions really, if ever used when talking about number 10s, will be dismissed?
Instead of saying he's gifted, just say he used his gifts well, and that just covers everything. So you had a certain body shape, a certain ability to move in a certain way. So you manipulated that and changed that and worked on that and trained, learned everything you have to learn to make it the best it possibly could. But that ain't enough. That's nowhere near enough. I wasn't offended by me when people said gifted. Maybe I was early because I knew how hard it would work. I was actually a wee bit more offended for my dad because he'd spent so much time working on it, and teaching these things. And I'm thinking, well, and it was just a gift then. It was a bit harsh on him. I mean, I couldn't do 2 and 3 hours every single day of my life with football on my feet unless I loved doing it. And I happen to love actually doing it. So you have to have all those things. And you also have to have a willingness to do it when it's not fun. You realise that actually this is just a grind just now, but you need to get through it. So you have to have all those things. Some things have changed. There's very much a mindset of people complain, oh, I can't do that. That's too difficult for me. It's unfair. You're working me too hard. There will be people all around the world that are not looking for a victim status. They're not looking for a weakness in themselves. They're looking for a way around it. There's people out there in the world that don't do that. You have to have that hunger in elite sport, and that's just the way it is. It's a real sadness refuting that and saying it's a nonsense and it's not the way to be.
It's a great outlook to have. So I take it you think that the playmaker role is something that can be taught and learned then?
It can be. That's a good question. It's probably the best question about it, because there are certain people you think, right, okay, I'll stick you in there and you could stay there for 40 years and you'll never learn to be any good at it. You have to have certain awarenesses. This 360 awareness, Pele used to talk about it a lot, of this ability to take one look and then run 20 yards and you still receive the ball knowing where everyone would be, even though they'd all moved.
That reminds me of a quote Paul Gascoigne said when he was still playing. He said it's hard to describe his gift of vision on the pitch. The best way he could do it was to say that you could start a game and be in any area of the pitch, then you could pick him up and place him in any other area of the pitch without him looking, and he'd be able to tell you exactly where everyone on the pitch would be standing, both teammates and opponents, or words to that effect. He had this constant mental image in his head, so he knew where everyone was all the time.
It's a similar way of explaining how I felt about it. It's actually quite hard to understand not having it. It's just there. It's just calculated. You just know, you've looked around, you've checked around, you've figured it out, and you do it all the time. You don't understand why everyone doesn't do it. It's the weirdest thing. Gaza explains it well. So that's spatial and time awareness. I think that's very difficult to really teach. You can adapt it. You can make it better. There are various coaching methods out there at the moment that are developing to make that better. So you can adapt that and you can make that better. But I think that's a brain ability. Handy to have that within you. You've got that within you, it makes it much easier. There's certain big centre-halves you're thinking, I could put you in there for a century, mate. You're never going to understand how to do that.
Enjoying the podcast? If so, please subscribe and rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or your other podcast provider. Thank you. You think it's a kind of instinct then? I was going to ask you to break it down and describe as a professional the intricacies of, I suppose, the decision making that goes through your mind when taking on a player or producing a piece of skill that to the observer just seems like natural instinct. Is it that? Is it subconscious, or do you consciously decide in millionths of a second what you're going to do or attempt, or is it a mixture?
And I know what you mean. I'll tell you that what to do. I mean, a lot of people who watch football play the league a bit, and they've had little glimpses of moments of what it's felt like to be in that, for a better word, and I hate the word, but for a better word, zone, right? Where you know where everything is, utterly balanced. And when you're there, now and again, if you're a pro, that happens quite a lot. You actually manipulate situations and you know how to get into situations like that. If you're a brilliant one, like some of the players we've been talking about, you live in that bubble. You live there. That's where you live. And you basically spend your entire time living there. And it's a good question, because that's how I've kind of looked at it. I've played in games where, the ball's come up to me and there's two defenders running at me. And I'm thinking, actually, I know how I'm going to beat you. I don't care. That's too easy. I'm thinking about the third guy. And the ball's not coming to me yet. The ball's not arrived to me yet. And I know what I'm going to do. But the third guy, he's coming at a different angle, so I need to adapt that. So try to explain to people like that, how you would do chess moves ahead. But in reality, yeah, that's what it feels like. You're on a plane, a different plane. I mean, I watch games and I do a lot of commentary. I watch one or two players and I see defenders running in towards Kevin De Bruyne and I'm thinking, right, I know exactly what you're going to do the next two moves. So I don't need to look at that. So I actually start looking up the pitch to see what he's going to do when he's done those two moves, which I know he's going to do, because it's so obvious to me. And I actually watch other players doing that now, and it's a joy to do it. For all these years, the player that I've enjoyed watching most in the Premier League is probably David Silva, because he was the most similar to the style that I tried to do. Notice I don't never say he was like me or I was like him. No, that's what I was doing or trying to do. And sometimes I would get to that level. And so that's exactly the type of player I was trying to be.
Do you think it's harder to try and explain that to people who, and obviously I don't want to get into an argument about people who maybe talk about the game and write about the game who have never played the game at any kind of level. But do you think that kind of feeling is harder to describe to somebody who's perhaps never played?
Well, you've asked about it. You've asked about it. So anyone who bothers to ask about it has thought about it. You tend to find we don't ask about it a lot. It's usually a very anodyne question. So I went through most of it. Nobody ever asked you that, so you didn't answer. Why would you? I remember talking to Jose Mourinho once, watching a tactical thing he done in a game, and it was utter genius. It was complete and utter genius. He won a game in 2 tactical moves. It was one of the best things I've ever seen. And after the game, I was talking to him, and I said, "How many people do you think saw what you did there?" And he asked me, "What did I do?" And I told him. He went, "Yeah, you're correct. That's what I did." I said, "How many people saw that?" He goes, "Well, certainly none of the journalists did." And I went, "Right. Why don't you tell them afterwards?" And he said, "They don't want to know." So that depth and sophistication of that sort of question that you've just asked, people don't ask it. It's as simple as it's nothing more complicated than that. People just don't ask.
I'm all about the football, you see. The reason I've asked you it is because I've played competitive football all my life. Always amateur level and nowhere near, obviously, the levels that you got to. But I love playing every day and wondered just how it felt. And when things have come off for me, or when I felt in the zone, as you stated, if that is a little glimpse as to how it feels at professional level also, to get that insight.
Well, the other thing to let you know, I say, as a phrase that I often say, and I just get laughed at, you often hear after your career, you say, "Oh, how many goals did you score?" I was more interested in creating them. I found that much more fun. I found that much more sophisticated. I found that much more rewarding. And people just go, "Oh, don't talk rubbish." They don't believe you. And I'm thinking, you've no idea. It's 10 times as good doing that brilliant piece of creativity that slices an entire defence and puts 3 people off their stride and then leaves the ball for a centre forward to tap it in. And he gets all the plaudits. And you're thinking, yeah, but I did all the real intelligent work there. For me, that was miles ahead, the most enjoyable part. The joy of the creativity. Then you start talking about sport and art. Why do people do art? Well, they don't do it for a big reward, do they? They do it because they want to create something. I certainly play football for the creativity because I love the creativity. It's something absolutely and utterly joyous. And that gets us back to where we started, number 10. This summed up with the word creativity. And that's maybe where I've spent my entire career and after my career trying to explain to people that we don't think about it as much in the British game. But having said that, it's much better than that, mostly because people from the outside were brought in.
There's something really special about a piece of play that's unique.
If you do something incredibly creative and then you score yourself with the creativity, that's a good thing. And by the way, that's not to say scoring isn't fun. Oh, it was secondary for me without a shadow of it.
I wrote an article a few years ago on that actual topic, discussing great goals where the number 10 who scored it actually created it also. So they should be credited really for the assist, in my eyes at least. For example, Dennis Bergkamp's iconic goals with Newcastle and Argentina. Or Rivaldo's spectacular chest and overhead kick against Valencia. Or there's one of Roberto Baggio's from Brescia against Juventus, where he, with one single touch, controlled the long-term ball coming out to the sky and rounded the goalkeeper, Edwin van der Sar, with the same single touch, which left him with an open goal to knock the ball into. It was phenomenal, magical goal. But in all those instances, should the players who passed the goal scorers the ball deserve the assist, or the goal scorer who produced the exceptional piece of magic, in essence, passing it to themselves before scoring? So who's the best number 10 you shared a pitch with in your career as both a teammate and who you played against?
I played against Maradona, so that helps.
It's an easy answer then.
I love playing with Beardsley. And he kind of played a 10-ish role. His first season was my last season at Everton, and Howard and Kendall never played us together. That was precisely the type of player I wanted to play with. And it was so tantalising to be within touching distance of exactly the player you wanted to play with. And there was a guy called Ivano Benetti who played with me at Tranmere.
Ah, yeah, Benetti. Yeah, he won titles at Juventus and Sampdoria.
Utterly brilliant. His skill levels were absolutely astonishing. He'd won the Champions League. I wanted to get a chance to play with him, and of course he came my last year at Tranmere. And it's such a shame that you get so close. Because the British game was, you can't have two of them. And you look back now, you think, all you had to do is give some of those players a chance together. And as your Silvers and your De Bruynes and your Xavis and Iniestas and all that, even they fell into it, they never let it happen.
your favourite Fantasista ever? So in this section, we'd ask our guests to name their absolute favourite number 10. Who would yours be and why? Is it Diego Maradona?
You have to be more specific by saying favourite. Do you think the best? Do you like
to 2 levels? So I'd like your favourite and who you think is the perfect 10.
Right, well,
if it's different.
My favourite is Messi.
Okay.
You know, and I know he doesn't play 10 all the time, but he has played 10. I don't know if he was more skillful than Maradona. I think it's an argument well worth having. At pure skill levels, Maradona was unbelievable. The things that I watched him do, we don't have enough footage of him. You know, every bit of footage I could find in Maradona, I used to find. He's the only player I ever knew. The pitches were so rubbish back then. He used to work with the bobbles. I mean, how do you do that? How can your feet be that quick that if a ball bobbled, he could actually work with the bobble? And I was like, wow, it was an extraordinary thing to see. And to put Diego in the game now, with pitches as they are, the protection that he would be given, it's unthinkable what he could do. No great surprise that you're looking at, Argentinians and Brazilians, and I would say them too. And of course, I'd love to say Pele, but I didn't see enough of Pele firsthand. It was a real shame. I'd love to see Pele firsthand. I got to know him a little bit. Actually, we became quite good friends. How big a name drop is that? So I'd like to have seen him.
How do you think Pele would have described himself as a position-wise?
Honestly, you couldn't tell. He was everywhere. He could be a centre forward. He could be a right winger. He could be a 10. He could be I think what they had done when they were at their best, probably 17, they had, I think there was it 5 or 6 players who you could easily describe as number 10s playing in that team.
They called it the team of the 5'10s, didn't they?
Mental. I mean, just mental. When Gizinho could play 10 and Pele could play 10 for style. You look at it now and you think, why did no one else try that? If you want, you can actually see a direct link there between them and to some degree Ajax and then the Dutch team and then Cruyff and then Barca. There's a link there. There's a kind of, you can follow where that goes there.
Going back to talking about Maradona before and his control on muddy pitches, did you see the recent film by Asif Kapadia?
Yeah.
I thought that was phenomenal with the pitch side footage that they had showing the exact speed and the way he talked about how he had to cope with the change into the Italian game. He had to speed up some of his movements and slow down some of his movements to be able to adapt to the rhythm of the game. So that was fascinating.
Those are fascinating. Way back in time, I'd be going for Chelsea. Any programme going about Italian football or the Spanish football, I'd record it. And then I would edit out the Maradona moments and look at my jaw on the floor and see the things he did. Do you know what? I've still got one on my phone right now. It's a clip he did with Argentina against Germany. The ball was given and the ball ran through. So he's running towards the goalkeeper slowly. The ball's running beside his left foot. So he has flicked it with the outside of his left foot behind him, turned round, and by the time he turned round, the ball had come over his head and landed on his left foot across his body. That shouldn't be possible. Snap your interior cruciate doing that. I went back and I tried to learn that. Jeez, oh, did I work on that. I got a kind of version of it. To be fair, nowhere near what he did. It's one of the most incredible things I've ever seen. I think Martin Tyler was commentating, I can tell you that right now.
Yeah, and his description on the commentary is great skill.
Great skill? That's bloody impossible. If you're a football fan and you watch that almost a TV camera position, you can see everything, right? Do yourself a favour. Go down to pitch level and just watch it there for a while. Just get down there. Somehow go and watch it. Completely and utterly different game because you've not got the overview. And it looks dead easy. And particularly on television cameras, I do a lot of commentary. People go, why did he not see that 40-yard ball? And I'm thinking, because there was 7 players between him and that view. But you can't see that from up in the gantry. If you watch Maradona, he always knew where everyone is. And then when you got down to that pitch level, which you're talking about from that film, the speed of him was extraordinary, wasn't it? The way he moved the ball.
Superb. So just finally then, if you were creating your ultimate number 10, or we were creating our ultimate number 10, what one attribute or physical body part from any number 10 in the history of the game would you give? So, for example, you could choose Messi's left foot or Platini's passing, Maradona's impudence. What would you?
Well, it's It's actually the same body part for every single one of them. It's the brain. That's all it is. All the other stuff is secondary.
Pat, thanks so much for spending your valuable time on the Number 10 podcast. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. I hope you've enjoyed it.
I have done. Actually, you made me forget that I've been unwell today. So, and I'm slightly on the mend now, so you've made me forget.
No problem. Is there somewhere where our listeners can hear more from you, or you mentioned before you're writing a new book, aren't you?
Yeah, I've written a book called The Accidental Football, which I'm really happy with. When I say I wrote it, as opposed to ghosted it with somebody else. So I've written this, and hopefully it'll be published within the next 6 months or so. I'm on 5 Live a lot. I'm on a lot of things. As you can tell, I'm not that up for selling. I'm just enjoy listening to this and enjoy watching the football.
There you have it, listeners. Pat Nevin. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did speaking with him. Such a thoughtful and insightful man who just loves the game and the players who light it up with skill and creativity. I thought his insights on what it was like to play professionally as a creative player were fascinating, and his outlook on improving as a player and life in general are inspiring and refreshing. Imagine sharing a pitch with playmaking royalty like Kenny Dalglish, Peter Beardsley and Diego Maradona like he did. That Maradona trick Pat described, by the way, I've added a link to it in the show notes, so check it out, and if you can recreate it, send us a clip. I've also added a link to the article which featured those iconic goals, both created and scored by the same number 10. So check them out too and let me know your favourite. Until next time, Fantasista fans.